Howdy partner, got me some hankering for this rootin' tootin' 6-gun review of Wyatt Earp. And this is a novelisation of the 1994 film of the same name. Yes, sadly, it's the Kevin Costner bio and not the Kurt Russell one. However, by way of novelty in the novelisation world, this is actually written by Dan Gordon, who also served as co-writer of the screenplay with Lawrence Kasdan of Star Wars fame and Disney Star Wars infamy. As you're no doubt aware, this is the sort of story that puts the stern in Western, following the skull-cracking Wyatt Earp through his various roles with American law enforcement. Naturally, along the way he falls in love and runs afoul of them, their cattle rustlers and the like. I think this film is generally regarded as being fairly faithful, and in the brief introduction, Gordon acknowledges his debt to a number of historians. The story begins with young Wyatt running away from home to join the army and fight in the Civil War, a war his father will spare him from and that his brother James will return from with some personal demons. The story then skips forward 7 years to young Wyatt finding, wooing and losing his first love and their unborn child. He burns down the family home he had built for them and heads west and makes a reputation as a hard-nosed lawman. After growing tired of the skull-cracking business, Wyatt and his brothers head to the charming-sounding town of Tombstone, and they hope to seek their fortune and leave the justice to others. Unfortunately, Tombstone has a crime problem exacerbated by a corruption problem, and the Earps get dragged into both. Wyatt, tired of his grim second wife Mattie, falls in love with the far more charming Josie. When the lawlessness reaches a crisis point, Earp and co are involved in a shootout at some sort of corral, an average one perhaps, mediocre possibly, but definitely no better than okay. And this kicks off a seesawing of one faction gaining the upper hand over the other and puts Wyatt in a string of legal troubles. Eventually Josie and Wyatt set up a home together, which he then leaves to hunt the last of the bandits down. Earp is one of those figures that kind of defines the Wild West, even for those who only know him as a lawman. This novel scratches the surface of the man without really exploring the questions around him. Was he a hero, or was he a violent man pursuing his own ends? The law a veneer over his desire for vengeance. In truth, it's his father who might actually have made a better subject for a bio like this. A judge relentlessly committed to his family, he struggles with the changes to that family, whether they're caused by experiences in the Civil War or Wyatt's more personal tragedy. His sudden decision to head west is the springboard for the text, but for a dominant figure likened in the first chapter to a righteous Old Testament sort of God, his fleeting involvement in the events that follow are a shame. Wyatt, raised with the same sort of principles, is somewhat less multidimensional. He's broken by his first wife's death, and he drifts from one situation to another. Even his involvement with various law agencies begins purely out of his need for a steady paycheck and Wichita's need for an imposing figure to keep the rowdier cowboys from shooting each other. Not exactly a calling, but Wyatt turns out to be pretty good at it regardless, breaking sufficient skulls at $2.50 a time to earn more than $1,000 in a month. His relationship with his brothers is repaired, and the entire Earp clan heads to Tombstone to seek their fortune in a more peaceable way. It is this move and his introduction to Josie that in part sours his relationship with his second wife Mattie. It's an interesting side to his character because with Arilla, his first wife, his relationship is shown to be one based on love. But then when he's a later, older man, defined by a resolute and determined character, he's unable to reject, or simply unwilling to reject, Mattie's overtures when Gordon tells us that he has actually no feelings for her. Yet Mattie is a fringe character at best. Even though the wives of his brothers James, Virgil and Morgan tend to side with Mattie, Gordon doesn't include enough of them or her for this side of Earp's character to be explored as much as it might. His infatuation with Josie reads rather like something out of a teenage vampire romance. Earp is by now an older and more mature figure, but he reacts like a teenager in love, in keeping with the times of course, and Josie is written as an anachronistic modern woman, involving herself determinedly in matters that men around her would likely have excluded her from. She wears the trousers in her relationships with Johnny Beam, and doesn't exactly labour over rejecting him for Wyatt. Part of that is due to the constraints of a 246-page novelization, but it's an interesting portrayal of her, given the acknowledgement of the historical sources in the introduction, when those same sources portray Josie in a far less flattering light. Wyatt is a figure of such renown that Gordon seems determined to cover all of the events and the characters in his life, famous or not. The first 5 scenes of the novel, none more than 2 or 3 pages long, go through 4 different time periods and 4 different but significant events in the life of the man. Squeezing all of that into a novel or a novelization of its length inevitably shortchanges some of them, Wyatt's brother's Doc Holliday in particular, which makes the decision to include certain events even more surprising. The Clanton family's familial squabbles, their accomplice Mike Gray and his son, all seem to take up rather a lot of room. Their demise is then caused by Mexican ambush that the Earps and their allies have no involvement in. The historical accuracy perhaps does the story no favours, but given the licence taken with Josie, you wonder if perhaps there's a better take on this story out there. After all, there are sources out there that suggest that Virgil Earp was the more central figure in the events in Tombstone and the more experienced lawman, which suggests that poetic license has been applied to the actual history before the writers here applied some of their own. Earp, in his lifetime, had a far less clear-cut reputation that only gets lip service in a novelization that moves along at perhaps too brisk a pace and with too many side characters to truly be described as a biography. The flip side to that is the book is very readable, and it rarely labours on a scene or a point, and is generally enjoyable in a way that is perhaps at a touch at odds with the movie it's based on, which has a reputation, deserved or not, as rather po-faced. One scene which rather sums up a lot of what I've been discussing is when Wyatt learns and approaches his brother James after discovering that James's wife Bessie is working as a prostitute. The scene takes up the better part of 2 pages. Not a great deal, but this is a short novel trying to accomplish a great deal. And Bessie's involvement in proceedings is practically nil beyond this point, and a passing mention later on makes us assume that much of this is intended as comedic relief. But what does the scene actually say about Earp, who is awkward in broaching the subject, but accepts the situation meekly and later considers that as a policeman he would be able to keep his brother's wife out of jail? But in terms of Wyatt as our lead character, his initial unease suggests a morality that his later acceptance undercuts. Perhaps it demonstrates a willingness to change his morals as his own needs dictate. But if the scene is intended to be a serious exploration of that side of his character, then again, perhaps it's inconsistent with the comedic tone which undercuts that. As part of a very busy plot with a cluttered cast, perhaps it's simply unnecessary, mildly amusing though it is. In opposition of the general reputation of this film, quite a lot of the story here can be seen as either amusing or trying to be. One scene with a cowboy out to make a name for himself, only to be sent packing by Earp wearing nothing but his birthday suit, is likely to raise a smile, but has all the same weaknesses as the scene mentioned previously. Does it move the story along or demonstrate anything about Earp that is necessary to his story? His established reputation as a lawman is, after all, what brings the fame-seeking cowboy to him in the first place. The novel consistently tries to be funny, and while the Undertaker thanking Wyatt for business is so unoriginal as to rather miss the funny bone, Bat Masterston's observation that Tombstone sounds quiet works rather wryly on 2 levels without exactly being a rib tickler. The fact that the novel tries so hard to be funny actually undercuts those moments when it does succeed. Anybody working that hard at something is probably not very good at it. Which is a shame, because this book starts with a great scene setting up Nicholas Earp, Wyatt's father, as this godlike figure haloed by the sun, the threat of his punishment enough to agitate even the animals. No other character in the novel will be introduced so well, and no other scene will be written with such aplomb, with Wyatt's courage written as a metaphorical screw tightening with his resolve to stand up to this domineering figure. It's a desperate shame that the standard of that opening couldn't be maintained, and while there are some other nice touches like the terminally grumpy Wyatt using affable as an insult, there is also this. White's screams were subsiding now, and you could hear a rattle begin in the back of his throat as his body began to convulse. Morgan, lying on his back on the pool table, had his mouth open, and now with every breath came a rattle back in his throat. Now you may think that these two scenes should be read in a way to compare them both and their impacts, the death of Marshall White and Morgan Earp, both usher in a new era of violence to Tombstone, connecting them in a literary way, and it should invite that understanding in the reader. But is that really what's happening here, or is Gordon really just short on variety in his prose, and perhaps there's an answer on your screen right now? But the most disappointing part of the novel is the dull, matter-of-fact style that the violence is written in. Curly Bill and Wyatt slug it out bare-fisted and without any impact or emotion being related to the reader. The famous shootout at the OK Corral is related in a way that is so determined to be factually accurate that it lacks any kind of excitement. Ike ran off just as Tom got off a shot with his rifle, hitting Morgan in the shoulder blade and neck. Morgan went down. Wyatt whirled and shot at Tom, and the shot grazed the horse, who bolted. Doc let go with both barrels of his shotgun, hitting Tom. Then Tom, holding his torn open stomach, fired again and hit Doc in his hip, sending him down. The blood and violence of the story's most famous event is reduced to little more than a tame and PG-13 friendly list. It's a shame because the dramatic opening and the fame of the lead character promise a great deal, and Gordon's novel comes up a little bit short. It is, however, an occasionally amusing story that tries to be mostly faithful to its sources. The busy plot moves along fairly rapidly, skipping from year to year in a somewhat disjointed opening before settling in to tell the more famous aspects of the story, those from the aptly named town of Tombstone. With a busy plot and a huge array of characters to cover, the novel could have stood to be twice as long as it is, or perhaps just a little bit smarter about what is included and what isn't. In truth, if the Wyatt Earp myth shortchanges Virgil, then this attempt to cover that myth shortchanges Wyatt himself. The novel never really gives itself time to breathe or truly explore, and is, perhaps predictably, more of a biography for younger readers. It's never boring, but it's a touch short of what it could have been and what the mythos deserves. Worth your time if you're a fan of either The Man, the movie, or The Wild Wild West, and yes, even that one if you must. Like the corral the shootout takes place in, this novel is simply okay. Anyone accustomed to staying to the end of these reviews will know I like to save a bit of moaning until the end, so let's have a look at this little passage from halfway through the novel. Christmas in Tombstone that year held little promise of rain, just wind, cold, hard-biting, whipped through the cracks in the wall, chill to the bone wind. And I guess that hyphens count as a style if you don't have anything else to fall back on. I'm sure it seemed like a good idea when the author was 12, but if you're going whole hog, shouldn't there be one here? And if not, there should be a comma, and probably a colon, and just generally knowing when something is overcooked or not. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe, and if you ring the bell, I will see you in the next one. And doing all of those things really helps the channel out, and I appreciate it a great deal. Thank you, and goodbye. Well, I guess the real question from all of that is, whose side would Wyatt Earp have been on?